if you buy a Glidecam, you don't need a gym membership, but you might need to switch hands like every take just to make sure you're...
For the past few years, whenever I would need to shoot something handheld, I would bolt my camera onto this Glidecam HD2000 that I bought used for about $200. In case you didn't know, Glidecam was actually the gold standard for image stabilization for handheld and run and gun type of shooting. That is, until motorized gimbals like this one came onto the market. With gimbals like the Ronin RS3 coming onto the market at pretty reasonable prices, stuff like my Glidecam is starting to become obsolete. Or is it? Because although motorized gimbals are a little more convenient and a little easier to use, that does come with a higher cost. So today it's a fight to the death. My old Glidecam HD2000 against the new DJI Ronin RS3. Let's jump into it. And if you want to check out either of these stabilizers for yourself, as always, links are in the description. This category I'm going to call price and robustness. Let's take a closer look at each stabilizer. Firstly, the cost of these. Now, this exact model I have right here is actually discontinued, but the most comparable model would be the Glidecam XR Pro, which comes in at $289 US. Although you can still find the HD2000 used in pretty good condition. One perk of the Glidecam is it's simple. There's no motors, no electronics, which means it's super sturdy. It's just a few pieces of metal and a little ball joint in here that rotates this thing around. It's very rare that anything on the Glidecam will break, which means if you find one used, it's probably going to be in pretty good condition. It also means that if you have a Glidecam, it'll last pretty much forever, and you can actually be pretty rough with these. Now, I'm not going to try this, but as long as my camera wasn't attached to it, I'd feel pretty comfortable just chucking this thing across the room, and I have no doubt that it would be fine. Now for the RS3. The RS3 comes in at a higher $549 US, but there's also a combo option that comes in at $719, which is what I have. The combo comes with a few accessories, including a second handle, a follow focus system, and a case to put everything in. These extras were well worth it for me because I'm going to use them all on a pretty regular basis. But the first big drawback to all the tech going on in here is that it's a lot more fragile. You have to be careful how you treat this setup. You can't be rough with it, and you got to be careful how much weight you put on it. Speaking of weight, let's talk about the weight of each of these guys and how much weight they can hold. The Glidecam weighs about 2 pounds, but that can quickly change because the way you balance the Glidecam is by adding counterweights to the bottom. So the heavier your camera setup is, the more weights you need to put on the bottom, which can really increase the weight of this thing. But in terms of camera weight, the Glidecam can support up to 10 pounds. Now, I don't know if you'd ever actually want to run a setup like that because a 10-pound camera plus the Glidecam plus the counterweights you need to add on would probably end up being around 15 pounds, and I don't think anyone would really want to carry that around with them all day. But still, if you're running any mirrorless or DSLR setup, you're never gonna have to worry about it. And you could probably even run a smaller cinema camera setup on this if you wanted to. Then there's the Ronin. The RS3 comes in a little heavier at just under 3 pounds, but only supports a payload of 6.6 pounds. Because you need to account for the strength of the motors and everything going on in there, you can't hold quite as much weight. But 6.6 pounds is still a decent amount, and if you're rocking any kind of mirrorless or DSLR based setup, you're probably going to be fine. One issue you may have though is clearance. When you mount your camera on the Glidecam, it's just a flat plate. There's nothing around it, there's nothing over top, which means you can add a camera cage, you can use a taller pro body, you can add a microphone on top, and you're not gonna have any issues. The Ronin, on the other hand, has these motors that need to go over top of the camera, especially if you wanna go into briefcase mode. Everything rotates over top of the camera, so if you attach anything on top of the camera, a light, a microphone, a monitor, you're going to limit the functionality of the gimbal because you're gonna have clearance issues. So far, it may seem like the Glidecam's actually winning this fight, but now we're going to talk about mounting and balancing, which is where you're going to see a lot of the convenience of the RS3 shine through. Starting with the Glidecam. It doesn't come with any mounting hardware, which means you either have to buy a separate quick release plate for it, or choose the much more painful option like I did and just bolt your camera directly onto the plate. This sucks for a couple reasons, the main one being it takes a few minutes to take your camera on and off because you have to take it off and then undo the screw to get the camera off. You also can't access the battery door while it's mounted on here, which means you need to take the whole camera off to change the batteries every time one dies. I'm telling you from experience, if you have a Glidecam, getting the quick release plate for an extra $40, $50 is going to save you a world of headache. A couple minutes doesn't sound like a lot of time, but it can really add up, and especially when you're shooting something run and gun, you don't want to miss a moment in that downtime. Now for balancing. This is my least favorite part of this. Balancing your camera on the Glidecam for the first time consists of dropping the camera from horizontal to vertical and counting the amount of time it takes to swing down. Then adjusting the counterweight distance so that it balances out on the gimbal. Once you have that locked down, you then have to do the fine tuning where you adjust the plate on top, side to side and front to back until it's perfectly balanced. This whole process, especially when you haven't done it before, for your first time setup will probably take you half an hour to an hour to set up. But as long as you're using the same camera and lens setup and no extra accessories the next time you use it, you shouldn't really need to do much. It should still be balanced from last time. Just maybe some fine adjustments, which might take you 5 to 10 minutes. But if you change anything about this setup, even just changing the zoom on the lens or adding an ND filter, you're going to need to rebalance it because the whole system will be off. There's no motors to hold it in place. If I'm shooting at 24 millimeters on my 24 to 70 and then I zoom all the way into 70, the Glidecam just tips down slowly. So when you're out shooting and you want to change focal lengths, every time you're going to need to take a second and just readjust the gimbal. Once you get the hang of it, it's not too bad, but it's still a big pain. This can especially be a pain when you're shooting something like a wedding, because the proceedings aren't going to grind to a halt because you need to balance your camera setup. Now, the first time setup on the RS3 was a little bit challenging for me, I'll admit, but this is because I tried to set it up without watching any tutorials or following any instructions. I just kind of went for it, and that was the wrong decision. I think if I followed DJI's video tutorials from the beginning, it would have taken me maybe 20 minutes tops for the first time setup. The nice thing about the RS3 is that the motors can compensate for little tiny adjustments to the setup. So if you want to change the zoom or add a filter onto the front of your lens, you don't have to rebalance the entire thing. This sounds like a minor detail, but it's really nice to not have to be constantly worrying about the little adjustments. Once you have the setup balanced, you can just run the RS3's auto calibrate, which takes about 30 seconds and just automatically kind of calibrates the motors and everything to get you set up so you're good to go. Next, I want to look at ease of operation. What does it take to get smooth, usable footage out of both of these? The Glidecam is tough to use. Even once it's perfectly balanced, you basically have to be constantly adjusting and making sure that your footage is going to be smooth. If you're not actively trying to make a smooth camera movement, it's not going to be smooth. It's not even going to be usable. This means knowing how to do the ninja walk, knowing how to support the camera all in one hand while making minor adjustments with the other hand, and you have to pay close attention to each camera move you're doing, or else it's just not going to turn out. It also takes a lot of time to learn the Glidecam. If you pick one of these up, you definitely won't be getting good footage from it right away. It's going to take some practice. Now, I have a few years of experience with this Glidecam, which means I can get some decent footage from it. But my friend Anthony has only ever used his DJI Ronin RS3. He's never tried a Glidecam, and I made him use it, and this is how the results turned out.
Oh my gosh, is this even right? I hold it like that? Hi, I'm Anthony, and I don't even know what this is called, but I've never used one before. What's it called?
Glidecam.
Glidecam. I've never used the Glidecam before. No.
Make some micro adjustments with your hand there.
I have to nudge it like that?
Yeah. You can like leave your hand on there if you want, but just like very lightly.
Okay. Well, the horizon's crooked. Oh, now we're... Oh, this is terrible. Okay, so my right arm, extremely tired. And I just feel like the footage is bumping all over the place.
Yeah.
Like the nice thing with the gimbal is you can pick it up and go. This, I'm like, oh, now both of my hands have to think. And I can't do anything because both hands need to be on the camera, whereas with the gimbal, you can use the little wheel and you can like turn the camera, you can focus with the camera. So weight-wise, I feel like even though they're about the same weight, the gimbal might actually be a little bit heavier, but because this is in one hand, it's like my hand is shaking. Like, look, it's like...
Now the RS3 on the other hand makes getting smooth footage so much easier. Yes, you still have to walk carefully and be mindful of your movements, but you basically just point it at what you want and it's gonna get smooth video. This is such a big deal for me because even after using the Glidecam for like 3 years, there's still about 30% of my footage that every time just goes to waste. It's unusable because for part of the clip I just wasn't fully balancing it, or I did something, or I tried to adjust the camera settings while I was holding it and it just threw the whole gimbal off. So every time I shot, a big chunk of my footage would just be thrown out right away because it was just way too shaky or wobbly from the Glidecam. This is the core reason that these gimbals have become so much more popular compared to Glidecams. They're just so much easier to use, especially for beginners, and the percentage of footage that turns out is so much higher. The only way the footage from this doesn't work out is if you do a camera move that you don't like or you frame your shot wrong, but footage on the Glidecam could be made unusable just because you took your left hand off the bottom for half a second. Okay, so with all that covered, let's take a look at some comparison shots. Anthony and I went out into the woods to test these two out, and this is what we found. First, walking at 35mm. This is where the results are most comparable. Even on the uneven forest ground, the Glidecam keeps up okay here, but the RS3 is still definitely smoother. Next, walking at 70mm. Once we zoom in, every little shake becomes more noticeable, and it's particularly more difficult to keep Anthony's face in the frame here while walking at the same time, especially with the Glidecam since it takes constant attention to make sure things are framed properly. Now here's where the results really differ. Running at 35mm. I got Anthony to do an almost full speed run while I tried to chase him, and this is where you really see a difference because the ground was so uneven I really couldn't look at my framing while running because I was focusing on not tripping. The Glidecam honestly didn't do as bad as I thought it would, and it's significantly better than if I filmed this handheld. But the RS3 turned out so much better because it keeps the same framing without my constant adjustment. So what's the conclusion here? Is the RS3 worth it? Should you just save your money and get a Glidecam? Well, that's really up to you. If you want something that's better than shooting handheld and you just really can't afford a motorized gimbal right now, a Glidecam is still a really solid option. But don't expect good results from it right away. It takes skill and constant attention to use this properly. But if you have that little bit of extra money, and especially if you're charging money for your video projects, I would absolutely recommend getting the RS3 or any motorized gimbal for that matter. You'll be able to pick it up and get good footage with it right away, and the amount of time that you will save by not having to make those minor adjustments and balancing all the time, it's going to be well worth the extra money. So let me know in the comments, what's your stabilizer of choice, and are you going to be picking up the RS3? But that's all I got for you for this video. If you want to check out a comparison between the RS3 and the older Ronin RS2, Anthony did a comparison video on his channel. You can go check that out by clicking the little eye in the corner or linked in the description. If you want to buy either of these stabilizers or check out all the other gear that I use on a regular basis, links for that are also in the description, as well as my social media links. If you liked this video and you got something from it, smash that like button. Consider hitting subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. I have a lot of cool content on the way. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.